Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of 14th to 18th century poetry. Topic of today's lecture is Adam Spenser's The Faerie Queen. I am presenting a synopsis of book 1. This very lecture is the part 2 of this series of lecture. Discussion agenda for today's class is that first of all I will review the last lecture to connect you with part 1 of this lecture, and then we will continue to study the stages of the journey of the Knight of Redcrosse in book 1. So in the last lecture we ended at that scene when King Arthur arrives at the gate of the giant castle, and there he blows his horn, his great horn, to summon out Orgoglio. Here we see that Orgoglio arrives out to fight with King Arthur. That is one of the main events. After that very event, we see that King Arthur narrates his story to the Knight of Redcrosse and Una. Though at that time, because the Knight of Redcrosse was there in the dungeon or in the jail of Orgoglio, he is weakened Redcrosse now. He meets despair, and this very event is again a very important event. After that we see that to recover the health of the Knight of Redcrosse, Una takes the knight to the House of Holiness. After that complete recovery, we see Una guides Redcrosse to her native soil, and there he fights with the dragon who is captivating the parents of Lady Una, and which is the actual task being assigned to the Knight of Redcrosse. So just to connect you with the last lecture, that the Faerie Queen is basically an epic poem by Edmund Spenser, and the books which we are having are only 6 books. Basically he was intending to write 12 books, but the material, the Faerie Queen, which is available to us, it comprises of 6 books. It is an allegorical work, and we see that in allegories there are several levels of meaning, like literal meanings, moral, historical and biblical meanings are possible. And all such type of meanings are available in the Faerie Queen. The stages which we covered in the last lecture are that the Redcrosse knight along with Lady Una and a dwarf begins his journey, and basically he is assigned a task by Gloriana, and Gloriana is the Faerie Queen, and she assigned the Knight of Redcrosse to save the parents of Lady Una, who were captivated by a dragon. On their way, the Knight of Redcrosse encounters with the beast of error. After killing that beast, they meet Archimago, and Archimago is a magician, and he succeeds in separating the Knight of Redcrosse and Lady Una. When these two are separated, the Knight of Redcrosse wanders. On the way he meets Sensfoy and Lady Fidessa. There we have a fight between Sensfoy and the knight. Here we see the knight kills Sensfoy. After that, Fidessa, who is actually Duessa, leads the Knight of Redcrosse to the House of Pride. We see another fight between Sensjoy and the Redcrosse. That very fight, we see Redcrosse gets injured, and after that, when Orgoglio the giant arrives on the scene, he overcomes the knight and throws him in the jail. So that was the journey of Redcrosse knight. On the other side, we see that Una is also wandering in search of a knight, and she also come across different events, and she suffers a lot of pains. When in the end of her that wandering, she come to know about the captivity of the knight, she meets King Arthur, and she requests King Arthur to help her. King Arthur swears to help Una, and then comes the story which I am going to describe in today's lecture. So at the gate of Giant's Castle, we see that King Arthur blows his great horn. Actually, this horn is to summon out Orgoglio, and we see that on hearing this horn, Orgoglio comes out of his castle, and he is followed by Duessa. Special thing is that Duessa is riding on 7-headed beast. At that very time, the giant attacks, and we see that he misses his first blow. Arthur then draws his arms, and he also attacks the Orgoglio. Meanwhile, we see that the squire who is accompanying King Arthur, he tries to hold off that 7-headed beast on which Duessa is riding, but he is drugged by Duessa, and nearly he was killed. But we see that King Arthur saves him and cuts off one of the head of that beast on which Duessa is riding. At that very moment, Orgoglio knocks King Arthur down from behind, and it was so close that he was going to kill King Arthur if King Arthur had not unveiled his shield, which blinded both the beast and the giant. It was so bright and so much full of light that it blinded both the beast and giant. Now we see that King Arthur brings the giant to the ground and chops off his head. And that very moment, when Una sees that King Arthur stands victorious, she runs into the castle and finds the dungeon where Knight lies. But Una sees that Redcrosse has been weakened almost unto death. And the Knight of Redcrosse was helped by Una and Arthur to get out of that jail. When they come outside, they take Duessa and just strip her so that Redcrosse can see that she is truly a witch. Then they leave her to flee into the woods. After that, they rest in the castle. And when they were there in the castle, the Lady Una asks Arthur to tell them about his name and lineage. This was a very uncomfortable spot for Arthur. He says that he does not know who his parents were, but he grew up in Great Britain and was tutored by the magician, and his name was Merlin. Una then asks what brought him to the fairy land, because the whole story which we are reading, or the story of the fairy queen, is basically in the setting of the fairy land. So here she asks King Arthur that what event brought him to the fairy land. And this was even more painful memory for King Arthur, because it was actually the love of a maid who had briefly appeared to him and called herself the Queen of Fairies. And that very dream led him to search for her in the fairyland. And he is doing that search from the last 9 months. So we see Redcrosse and Una gives their sympathy, but now they must continue on their quest, because King Arthur has to search that fairy queen, and the Knight of Redcrosse has to complete his task. So both of them exchange gifts, and they part after that. We see that the Knight of Redcrosse and Una continue their journey towards the Una's home, but the Knight of Redcrosse is too weak from his imprisonment in the dungeon in the jail of Orgoglio. When they were moving ahead, they see a knight that was running toward them in fright, and he is very frightened, and his name is Sir Trevison, and he claims to be fleeing a terrible man, and the name of that terrible man is Despair. He says that this Despair had already caused one of the Trevison's friends, Terwin, to kill himself. Redcrosse, being the knight, is eager to challenge Despair, and Trevison reluctantly leads them back to the cave where Despair is residing. When they enter, they see a gloomy old man that is sitting there, and there they see the Treven's body. And Redcrosse eagerly desires to take revenge from that despair. But the old man, who is named as Despair, he remains calm, and he very tiredly asks Redcrosse that what problem he has with the death. He says that death simply brings an end to life of sins, and thus for that reason we see that death does not come too soon. He is of that powers that he knows the Redcrosse sins and weaknesses, and almost he persuades the Knight of Redcrosse to take his life. Here Una interferes, and she stops him and pull him out of the cave of despair. So that very event is again showing the weakness of the Knight of Redcrosse, and we see that Una now knows for certain that this Knight of Redcrosse needs help. So she leads him to the House of Holiness, and we see that this House of Holiness is being reigned by Caelia, and she has three daughters, Fidessa, Spenser, and Carissa, and many other virtuous peoples live with them. Earlier we see that Duessa led the Knight of Redcrosse to the House of Proud, but here we see that Una leads weak Knight of Redcrosse to the House of Holiness, where virtuous people are living. On the other hand, we see that in House of Pride, deadly sins were living. So Caelia greets Una, and on hearing about the Redcrosse conditions, she commands her daughters to aid the Knight of Redcrosse in his recovery. First of all, Fidessa instructs him in the discipline and the gospel. Then we see Spenser comforts him so that his sins do not again lead to despair. Next comes the number of Carissa, and she instructs him in good, honest behaviors, and she instructs him of love and righteousness. So after these instructions, we see that they takes him to the hospital where 7 charitable men attends this knight, and they treat the physical ailments or the diseases of the Knight of Redcrosse. After that very treatment, we see that the Knight of Redcrosse is recovered in body and spirit. Both in body and spirit he is recovered. One another grace which the Knight of Redcrosse receives is that he has been taken to the high hill by an old wise hermit named as Contemplation. And from this very hill, the Knight of Redcrosse can see New Jerusalem, that is the holy city or the God's city, and on the other hand, he is able to see the Cleopolis, the city of the Faerie Queen. Now this knight is completely recovered, both in body and spirit. Here, Contemplation, that old hermit, he tells Redcrosse his history, the history of that knight, and he also narrates the future events to him. He tells him that he is not a fairy, but he is actually born from a mortal king, and he was stolen by a fairy, and that fairy brought that knight to the fairyland. And it is his destiny to become a great saint of England. And his true name is George. So that is the history and the future of the Knight of Redcrosse. Knight of Redcrosse get amazed by this very news, and we see that when he returns down the hill to the House of Holiness, there we see that Una is waiting for him, and soon we see that they depart. Una leads Redcrosse to her native soil. When they approach that castle, that is the Una's parents' castle, we hear a very terrible roar, and that is the roar of the dragon. Redcrosse just let Una to stand aside at a distance, and he confronts the beast. The poet just described the dragon that this very dragon is covered in flawless coat of scales, and these very scales are stronger than any metal, and that dragon has a long tail, and on his tail we see razor sharp spikes, and he has very powerful wings that carry him to meet the Knight of Redcrosse. When the dragon arrives on the scene, we see Redcrosse Knight charges at him and strikes him, but the weapon he used, or the spear he used, it just touches the dragon's surface and move away in another direction, because he is hiding in a very impenetrable or a thick hide, and it is not easy to penetrate that outer covering. So we see that both knight and horse, they fall to the ground. When they fall to the ground, the dragon grabs them in his massive claws and lifts them into the air. Here the Knight of Redcrosse struggles, and we see that in the end he forces the dragon to let them down. When they fall down, the Knight of Redcrosse again attacks the dragon, and he has a chance to strike one of the beast's wings, and finally he managed to leave a wound on the body of that dragon. At that very attack, the dragon gets furious, and we see that he knocks Redcrosse once again off his horse. But the knight is very fearless. He is not worried about anything. He once again takes his sword and tries to slice the head of the dragon, but it only shocks the dragon. We see again that angry dragon breathe out a fiery breath, and that burns the whole field. Redcrosse armor is heated so much that it burns him, and he makes twists and he turns in pain and agony. Another event that happens, that when the Knight of Redcrosse was twisting and turning, the dragon knocks him backward to kill him, but fortunately the knight falls back into the well of life. That very well of life has great powers to heal wounds. Dragon, however, simply assumes that he has won and he has killed the Knight of Redcrosse. Una is also worried about his hero, but actually the situation is very different. So that is the end of the fight of the first day between the dragon and the Knight of Redcrosse. On the second day, we see that the Redcrosse Knight emerges as good as new. His blades and he himself is more stronger, and we see that he is again ready to confront the dragon. When the fight starts, we see the Holy Knight cuts a deep wound in the beast's head. On this we see that dragon retaliates, and in revenge the dragon wounds the Redcrosse shoulder with its that sharp tail, and then that dragon tries to pull away the sacred shield with the Knight of Redcrosse wearing with its claws. The knight managed to cut off the claws, but as he retreats, he again falls, and this time he falls into the marshy and muddy area where sacred trees grows, so which, like the well of life, has again the magical powers. In this way, the second day of the fight ends, and we see that during the night, Una is worried about the night, and the dragon also nurses its wounds. So on the third day, Redcrosse again comes out from that marshy and muddy area, and we see that he is again refreshed and healed. Dragon is very furious to see the knight still alive, and it bends down its mouth fully open, and basically he is intending and he is trying to swallow the Knight of Redcrosse whole. But Redcrosse holds his ground, and he roughly forces his sword deep into the dragon's throat. on this very attack, the beast crashes to the earth like a mountain that is falling from the heaven, and we see that the dragon is dead. Una's father and mother, the king and the queen of that land, sees the defeat of the dragon, and they rush out to give thanks to the Redcrosse. The whole kingdom, which had been hiding in fear of dragon for the months, now they come out and they celebrate with music, with praise, and they were feasting there, and many gifts were offered to the victorious knight. And that was the common practice in the medieval ages, and the whole kingdom was expecting that the Knight of Redcrosse will marry Una. But Redcrosse here announces that he still has a duty to serve the queen, the Faerie queen, for 6 years in her battle against the proud king. So Una's father agrees that after that time his daughter shall marry the knight, and we see the engagement between the Knight of Redcrosse and Lady Una. But one special thing happened at that time. We see at that specific moment of that announcement of engagement of Lady Una and the Knight of Redcrosse, a messenger runs onto the scene, and he claims that this engagement cannot be made because Redcrosse has already promised his hand to another lady. The king demands an explanation from the Knight of Redcrosse. The Knight of Redcrosse tells him the whole story about Duessa, who only got his pledge by deceit and witchcraft, which she applied on the Knight of Redcrosse. Actually, the Knight of Redcrosse has given his love to imaginary lady, and that lady was Fidessa, and Fidessa was being played by the disguised Duessa. And when the Knight of Redcrosse sees the truth of that lady, now he is free to love another. So Una also seconds all this story, and she is the one who suggests that they should examine the messenger to see that if he is disguised as well or not. When they just examine that messenger, it turns out to be Archimago, who is actually that magician who initially separated Lady Una and the Knight of Redcrosse. After this very discovery, the celebration of the engagement continues until Redcrosse Knight leaves to fulfill his duty and destiny. So that is the whole story of the book 1, in which we see that a Knight of Redcrosse along with Una and a dwarf starts their journey to help out the parents of Lady Una and to save the parents of Lady Una from the captivity of the dragon. So in the Knight of Redcrosse successfully completed his assignment, and we see that he is again leaving to fulfill the other duties which the Gloriana may assign to him. So that is the story of book 1 of the Faerie Queen, and in the coming lectures we will see the allegorical meanings of the Faerie Queen, that how these characters represent the different other meanings by these characters of the romances. So thank you very much for listening passionately. Allah Hafiz. Assalamu alaikum.